December 7th, 1941. The island of Oahu, territory of Hawaii. The time is 6 a.m. In the pre-dawn darkness, a profound and deceptive peace hangs in the humid air. The sky is a canvas of deep indigo, just beginning to yield to the faintest blush of rose and gold along the eastern horizon. The Pacific Ocean, the great placid sea, breathes a gentle rhythm against the shores, its whispers the only sound to break the stillness. This is a place of sublime beauty, a tropical Eden that the United States Navy has transformed into its formidable forward bastion, the headquarters of its Pacific Fleet. It is a fortress, disguised as a paradise. At the heart of this fortress lies Pearl Harbor, a sprawling naval base nestled in a cloverleaf-shaped loch. Here, the steel titans of American sea power are gathered. 7 battleships, the pride and spine of the fleet, are moored along the southeastern side of Ford Island, an arrangement that will soon be known to history as Battleship Row. The USS California, the USS Maryland, the USS Oklahoma, the USS Tennessee, the USS West Virginia, the USS Arizona, and the USS Nevada. Their massive gray hulls, bristling with gun turrets, reflect languidly in the calm harbor waters. They are silent giants, slumbering. Aboard these vessels, thousands of sailors and Marines are still in their racks, dreaming of home, of family, of the day's planned leisure. It is Sunday, a day of rest, of church services, of baseball games and letters written home. The war raging in Europe and Asia feels a world away, a distant storm on a far horizon, something read about in newspapers but not yet felt in the bones. On a lonely promontory, at the northernmost tip of Oahu, at a place called Kahuku Point, 2 young Army privates, Joseph Lockhart and George Elliott, are nearing the end of their shift. They man a new experimental piece of technology, a mobile radar station, designation SCR-270. Its official name is Opana Mobile Radar Site. The machine is crude by later standards, a temperamental collection of vacuum tubes and oscillating screens, but it represents the cutting edge of military detection. Their duty is to scan the skies, to watch for anything unusual. For hours their screen has shown nothing but static, the electronic ghosting known as grass. Their shift was supposed to end at 7 a.m., but the truck scheduled to pick them up is late. To pass the time to continue their training on the new equipment, they leave the set running. It is a small, seemingly insignificant decision, one of countless such decisions made by ordinary men on an ordinary morning. But history often pivots on such moments. This morning it will pivot with the force of an earthquake. 150 miles north of their position, a terrible and magnificent force is gathering. 6 aircraft carriers of the Imperial Japanese Navy, the Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, Hiryu, Shokaku, and Zuikaku, turn into the wind, their vast flight decks pitching in the rough seas. This is the Kido Butai, the striking force, the most powerful carrier fleet ever assembled. For 10 days it has sailed across the storm-tossed North Pacific in complete radio silence, an undetected dagger aimed at the heart of American power. On their decks, the first wave of 183 aircraft are arrayed, Kate torpedo bombers, Val dive bombers, and the legendary Zero fighters. Their engines, meticulously warmed, begin to roar to life, a deafening chorus that shatters the ocean's quiet. Pilots, clad in their flight gear, perform final checks, their faces grim and determined. Many have written farewell letters to their families. Tucked inside their uniforms, they are samurai of the air, embarking on a mission from which many do not expect to return. The lead pilot, Commander Mitsuo Fuchida, climbs into his cockpit. He looks out at the spectacle, the culmination of months of relentless secret training. He feels, as he would later write, a sense of serene confidence. The fate of his empire rests on his shoulders, on the actions of the men he is about to lead into battle. The rising sun, the Hinamaru, painted on the fuselage of his plane, seems to burn with a fierce intensity in the growing light. Back at Pearl Harbor, the day begins to stir. Cooks in the galleys are preparing breakfast. On the deck of the U.S. Nevada, the ship's band assembles, their polished brass instruments gleaming. They are preparing to play for the 8 a.m. flag-raising ceremony. Sailors are beginning to emerge on deck, yawning, stretching, gazing at the idyllic scene. The Koolau Mountains, green and majestic, form a stunning backdrop to the harbor. The water is a placid mirror, reflecting the blue sky and the few scattered, cotton-like clouds. It is a picture of absolute tranquility, a scene of immense power at complete rest. But beneath this surface of calm, the gears of fate are turning with terrifying speed. The first threads of the morning's tapestry of chaos are being woven. Just outside the mouth of the harbor, the destroyer U.S. Ward, on routine patrol, spots a small, unidentified submarine attempting to follow a cargo ship into the channel. The submarine is one of 5 Japanese midget subs, tasked with infiltrating the harbor to sow confusion and sink ships. At 6:45 a.m., the ward's captain, Lieutenant William Outerbridge, commanding his first patrol, makes a decisive choice. He orders his crew to open fire. The ward's 4-inch guns bark, and one shell strikes the submarine's conning tower. As the sub begins to sink, the ward drops a pattern of depth charges, sealing its fate. Outerbridge sends a coded message to naval headquarters. "We have attacked, fired upon, and dropped depth charges upon submarine operating in defensive sea area." The message is clear, urgent, and unambiguous. But on a peaceful Sunday morning, it is met with skepticism and delay. It is processed, passed up the chain of command, but with a fatal lack of urgency. It is an alarm bell that no one is yet ready to hear. And then, at the Apana radar station, it happens. At 7:02 a.m., George Elliot notices something on the oscilloscope screen. A massive blip, larger than anything he has ever seen before. He calls over Joseph Lockard. They check their equipment, recalibrate. The blip remains. It is a huge formation of aircraft, approaching from the north, 132 miles away. They calculate its speed and trajectory. It is heading directly for Oahu. They know this is not normal. There are no scheduled flights of this magnitude. Lockard calls the information center at Fort Shafter. The officer on duty, Lieutenant Kermit Tyler, is on his first day in the job. He has heard that a flight of B-17 bombers is expected from the mainland United States. He makes a fatal assumption. He listens to the private's urgent report and replies with 5 words that will echo in infamy. "Well, don't worry about it." Lockard hangs up the phone, perplexed, but obedient. He and Elliot continue to track the approaching formation, watching it grow closer and closer, a silent, electronic harbinger of doom, until its signal is lost in the ground clutter from the surrounding mountains. The final warning has been given, and it has been dismissed. The system of defense, the men and the machines designed to protect this fortress, has failed at every critical juncture. The midget sub was a physical warning, the radar plot was an electronic one. Both were ignored, lost in the bureaucratic inertia, and the pervasive, deeply ingrained belief that an attack on this scale, at this location, was simply impossible. It was a failure not of technology, but of imagination. Now there is nothing left to stand in the way. The sky over Oahu remains placid and blue. The band on the U.S. Nevada continues to warm up. The sailors on deck are lining up for morning colors. The time is 7:48 a.m., Hawaiian time. The first wave of Japanese planes, led by Mitsuo Fuchida, crests the Koolau Mountains. Below them, laid out like a relief map, is their target, the American Pacific Fleet. At anchor, unsuspecting, vulnerable, Fuchida is stunned by the sight. It is perfect, even better than their intelligence had predicted. No carriers are present. They are at sea, a crucial stroke of luck for the Americans, though no one knows it yet. But the battleships are there, all of them. A neat, orderly row of targets. He sees no fighters in the air, no anti-aircraft fire rising to meet them. The surprise is total, complete. He slides back the canopy of his cockpit and fires a single green flare, the signal to his pilots, assume attack formation. But in the bright morning sun, he fears the flare might be missed, so he fires a second. This second flare, however, is the signal for a different plan, one to be used if they had lost the element of surprise. Confusion ripples through the formation. Some pilots follow the first signal, some the second, but it doesn't matter, the objective is the same. At 7:53 a.m., Fuchida orders his radio operator to tap out the coded message to the Kido Butai, the signal that they have achieved the impossible. Tu, the first syllable of the Japanese word for charge. Then, a few minutes later, as the first bombs begin to fall, he sends the most famous signal of the entire operation, a message that will inform Admiral Yamamoto and the Emperor himself that their great gamble has succeeded. Tora, 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 Tiger, Tiger, the code word for complete and utter surprise. On the ground, the last seconds of peace are ticking away. The final beautiful ignorant moments of the old world are evaporating in the tropical heat. In 90 minutes, everything will change. The world will be set on a new and terrible course, and for the men on Battleship Row, their Sunday morning is about to become an inferno. The first scream of a diving plane is about to tear through the tranquil air, the prelude to a symphony of destruction. Paradise is about to be lost. The seeds of the Pearl Harbor attack were not sown in the 10 days it took the Kido Butai to cross the Pacific. They were planted years, even decades, earlier in the soil of ambition, desperation, and irreconcilable worldviews. The path to that fiery Sunday morning was a long and complex collision course between two rising powers, the United States of America and the Empire of Japan, each with its own vision of destiny, each unwilling to yield in a struggle for dominance over the vast expanse of the Pacific Ocean. For Japan, the early 20th century was a period of breathtaking transformation and burgeoning power. In a single generation, it had transformed itself from a feudal, isolated nation into a modern, industrialized military force, stunning the world by defeating the Russian Empire in 1905. But this rapid modernization came with a voracious appetite. Japan is an island nation, famously poor in the natural resources required to fuel a modern industrial economy and a powerful military. It lacked oil, rubber, iron ore, and nearly every other critical material. To the Japanese leadership, a group increasingly dominated by a militaristic and ultra-nationalist faction, this dependence was a fatal weakness, a choke chain held by the Western powers. Their solution was expansion. They looked to the resource-rich lands of Asia as their rightful sphere of influence, their lifeline. This vision was formalized in the concept of the Greater East Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere, a euphemistically named empire that would see Japan as the dominant power, leading its Asian neighbors and controlling their resources, free from Western interference. The first major step in realizing this vision came in 1931, with the invasion of Manchuria. The League of Nations condemned the action but did nothing, a lesson in Western impotence that the Japanese military took to heart. Emboldened, they launched a full-scale invasion of China in 1937. The war in China became a brutal, all-consuming quagmire. The Japanese army committed horrific atrocities, most infamously the rape of Nanking, but it could not break the will of the Chinese resistance. The war became a massive drain on Japan's already strained resources, making their need for oil, steel, and rubber even more acute. The war in China was the furnace in which Japan's aggressive foreign policy was forged, and it was the primary point of friction with the United States. America, for its part, was a nation in the grip of deep isolationism. The trauma of the First World War had left a lasting scar, a profound desire to avoid entanglement in foreign conflicts. The prevailing sentiment was to focus on domestic issues, to let the rest of the world solve its own problems. Yet, America was not without its own interests in the Pacific. It had possessions like the Philippines and Guam, and it championed the open-door policy, a principle of free trade and respect for the territorial integrity of China. Japan's brutal campaign in China was a direct affront to this policy, and an offense to American moral sensibilities. The newsreels showing the bombing of Chinese cities, and the stories of Japanese atrocities horrified the American public. President Franklin Delano Roosevelt, an internationalist at heart, saw the growing power of the Axis, Germany, Italy, and Japan, as a direct threat to American security and democratic values. He was a captain trying to turn a massive ship of state against a powerful tide of public opinion. He had to move cautiously, incrementally, to counter Axis aggression without appearing to drag the country into another war. The relationship between Washington and Tokyo throughout the late 1930s was a slow, grinding deterioration. It was a diplomatic dance of protests, sanctions, and negotiations, all underscored by a fundamental inability to comprehend the other's position. From the American perspective, Japan was a rogue aggressor, tearing up international treaties and brutally subjugating its neighbors. The solution was to apply economic pressure, to use America's immense industrial and financial power to force Japan to change its course. From the Japanese perspective, the United States was a hypocritical, arrogant power, seeking to deny Japan its rightful place in the sun. They saw America as a bully, attempting to strangle their nation's economy and block its destiny. They viewed the American demands to withdraw from China as an unacceptable ultimatum, an insult to their national honor, and a threat to their very survival. In 1939, as war erupted in Europe with Germany's invasion of Poland, the situation in the Pacific grew even more tense. The fall of France and the Netherlands in 1940 left their resource-rich colonies in Southeast Asia, French Indochina and the Dutch East Indies, vulnerable. For Japan, this was a golden opportunity. The Dutch East Indies, in particular, was a treasure trove of oil, the one resource they needed above all others. In September 1940, Japan took a fateful step. It signed the tripartite pact with Germany and Italy, formally joining the Axis powers. That same month, Japanese forces moved into northern French Indochina. This was a direct challenge to the United States. Roosevelt's response was to tighten the economic screws. He placed an embargo on the sale of scrap iron and steel to Japan. It was a warning shot, intended to signal American resolve. The Japanese military, however, saw it as further proof of American hostility and pushed for an even more aggressive southward expansion. The decisive moment came in July of 1941. With Germany deep into its invasion of the Soviet Union, Japan saw its chance. It occupied the rest of French Indochina, positioning its forces to strike south towards the oil fields of the Dutch East Indies, and the British territories of Malaya and Singapore. For Roosevelt, this was the final straw. He had warned Japan against such a move, and now they had crossed the line. On July 26, 1941, he took the most drastic step yet. He froze all Japanese assets in the United States, and in concert with the British and the Dutch, initiated a full oil embargo. This was the economic equivalent of a declaration of war. It cut off over 80% of Japan's oil supply. The Japanese military's war machine, its navy, its air force, its tanks, would grind to a halt in a matter of months without a new source of fuel. The embargo presented the leadership in Tokyo with a stark and unavoidable choice: either capitulate to American demands and withdraw from China, a humiliating retreat that would mean the end of their imperial ambitions and likely the fall of the government, or go to war to seize the resources they needed from Southeast Asia. In Tokyo, a desperate and secret debate raged. The government was a complex and often fractured entity, a delicate balance between the civilian cabinet, the emperor, the army, and the navy. The prime minister, Fumimaro Kono, a civilian aristocrat, desperately sought a diplomatic solution. He proposed a personal meeting with President Roosevelt, a last-ditch effort to find a compromise. But the hardliners in the military, particularly in the army, were losing patience. They saw negotiations as a sign of weakness, a delaying tactic that only consumed their dwindling oil reserves. The war minister, General Hideki Tojo, a stern, unyielding militarist, became the leading voice for war. He argued that to back down now would be to betray the sacrifices made in China and to condemn Japan to the status of a third-rate power. The Navy, while more aware of the immense industrial might of the United States and the long odds of a protracted war, was also trapped. Its own prestige and existence depended on securing the southern resources. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, the brilliant and complex commander-in-chief of the combined fleet, was one of the few senior figures who had spent time in America and truly understood its power. He famously warned the cabinet, "If I am told to fight regardless of the consequences, I shall run wild for the first 6 months or a year, but I have utterly no confidence for the second or third year." He knew that a long war with the United States was unwinnable, but he was also a loyal officer of the emperor. If war was inevitable, he believed Japan's only hope was to strike a swift, devastating blow at the outset, to cripple the American fleet and shatter American morale, forcing them to the negotiating table before their industrial strength could be fully mobilized. In Washington, the diplomatic endgame was playing out. Ambassador Kichi Saburo Nomura and Special Envoy Saburo Kurusu continued to meet with Secretary of State Cordell Hull, but they were negotiating from an impossible position. The Americans insisted on a full Japanese withdrawal from China as a precondition for lifting the embargo. The Japanese military would never accept this. The talks were a dialogue of the deaf. Hull, a grim and moralistic Tennessean, grew increasingly frustrated. He felt the Japanese were being duplicitous, talking peace while clearly preparing for war. American intelligence, through a program codenamed Magic, had broken the Japanese diplomatic codes. They were reading Tokyo's secret messages to its embassy. They knew that a deadline had been set. The final message they intercepted, which became known as the 14-part message, was a long, rambling indictment of American policy, a clear prelude to a break in relations. They knew something was coming, and coming soon. But where, and when? The consensus among American military leadership was that the blow would fall in Southeast Asia, the Philippines, Malaya, or the Dutch East Indies. The idea of a direct, carrier-based assault on the fortress of Pearl Harbor, over 4,000 miles from Japan, was considered by most to be a logistical and strategic fantasy. It was a fatal failure of imagination. In mid-October 1941, the Kono government collapsed. The path of diplomacy had reached a dead end. Emperor Hirohito, in a move that sealed the nation's fate, appointed the hardline General Tojo as the new prime minister. The war party was now in complete control. The decision for war was made at an imperial conference on November 5th. The attack on Pearl Harbor, a plan conceived by Yamamoto and meticulously developed by his brilliant air staff officer, Commander Minoru Genda, was approved. The final diplomatic note would be delivered to the Americans just before the attack was scheduled to begin, a formality to maintain a veneer of honor. On November 26, the same day that Cordell Hull presented the Japanese envoys with a final, uncompromising proposal that amounted to an ultimatum, the Kido Butai, under the command of Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo, slipped out of its anchorage in the remote Kuril Islands and began its long, silent journey across the Pacific. The collision course, set in motion by years of ambition, mistrust, and failed diplomacy, was now in its final, irreversible phase. The two nations, separated by an ocean, were about to be joined forever by an act of spectacular violence. The gears of war had engaged, and the world was about to hear them grind. In the stark, windswept expanse of the Kuril Islands, a remote archipelago stretching north from Japan towards the Kamchatka Peninsula, a force of unprecedented power lay hidden. Tankin Bay, a desolate and fog-shrouded anchorage, served as the secret rendezvous point for the most audacious naval operation in modern history. It was here, in the final weeks of November 1941, that the 6 aircraft carriers, 2 battleships, 3 cruisers, 9 destroyers, and a fleet of support tankers of the Kido Butai gathered under a cloak of absolute secrecy. This was the silent dagger, forged by the Empire of Japan to be plunged into the heart of its most formidable adversary. The architect of this audacious plan was Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, Commander-in-Chief of the Japanese Combined Fleet. Yamamoto was a man of profound contradictions. He was a gambler, a poet, and a naval visionary. Unlike many of his army counterparts, he was not a blind nationalist. Having served as a naval attaché in Washington and studied at Harvard, he possessed a deep and sober respect for America's industrial might and the character of its people. He knew that a prolonged war was a suicidal endeavor for Japan. He had opposed the tripartite pact with Germany and Italy, and he had warned his government against provoking the United States. Yet, he was also a patriot, bound by duty to the emperor. When the decision for war was made, he accepted his role with grim determination. He reasoned that if war was unavoidable, Japan's only chance for survival lay in a single cataclysmic opening blow. It had to be a strike so swift, so devastating, that it would cripple the U.S. Pacific Fleet, shatter American morale, and buy Japan the precious time it needed to conquer Southeast Asia and fortify its new defensive perimeter. He believed that a demoralized America might then be willing to negotiate a peace that left Japan's new empire intact. It was a desperate gamble, a high-stakes poker game with the fate of nations as the prize. And the target he chose for this all-or-nothing bet was Pearl Harbor. The concept was revolutionary, and to many in the Japanese naval establishment, it was sheer madness. The logistical challenges were staggering. A fleet of over 30 ships would have to steam nearly 4,000 miles across the notoriously stormy North Pacific, a route chosen for its emptiness to avoid detection, all while maintaining perfect radio silence. Refueling at sea in such rough weather was a perilous and unproven feat for a fleet of this size. And then there was the attack itself. Pearl Harbor was a shallow anchorage, averaging only 40 feet in depth. Standard aerial torpedoes, when dropped from a plane, would dive deep into the water before leveling out, meaning they would simply bury themselves uselessly in the mud at the bottom of the harbor. The American naval base was also thought to be on high alert, protected by a ring of airfields and anti-aircraft batteries. The risks of failure, of detection and annihilation, were immense, but Yamamoto entrusted the detailed planning of the operation to a man of genius, Commander Minoru Genda. Genda was a brilliant, daring, and meticulous air officer. He embraced the challenge with ferocious intensity. He and his team worked in secret, poring over maps, intelligence reports, and even tourist postcards of Hawaii. They solved the torpedo problem by fitting the weapons with special wooden fins, which created more drag and prevented them from diving too deep. They devised a multi-pronged attack plan, assigning specific targets to different squadrons to maximize confusion and destruction. Dive bombers would target the airfields first, to eliminate any threat from American fighter planes. Then the torpedo bombers and high-level bombers would descend upon the unsuspecting battleships. The plan was a masterpiece of military precision, a symphony of destruction rehearsed down to the last detail. The training for the mission was relentless. The pilots, the elite of the Japanese naval air arm, were pushed to their absolute limits. They practiced for months in the secluded Kagoshima Bay in southern Japan, a location chosen because its topography closely resembled that of Pearl Harbor. They flew endless drills, honing their skills in low-level torpedo runs, precision dive bombing, and navigation over vast featureless stretches of ocean. They were more than just pilots. They were warriors imbued with the Bushido Code, the way of the samurai. They were taught that surrender was the ultimate dishonor, and that to die for the emperor was the greatest glory. This fanatical devotion gave them a fighting edge that was difficult for their Western counterparts to comprehend. The man chosen to lead the Kido Butai at sea was Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo. Nagumo was a cautious, conservative officer, a specialist in torpedo warfare, not aviation. He was deeply skeptical of the Pearl Harbor plan, acutely aware of the risks involved. He feared for his carriers, the most valuable assets in the Imperial Navy, but he was a loyal subordinate, and he followed his orders. His caution, however, would have profound consequences on the day of the attack. On November 26, 1941, the die was cast. Under the cover of a brewing storm, the Kido Butai weighed anchor and slipped out of Tenkan Bay, one ship at a time, disappearing into the gray mist of the North Pacific. The order for strict radio silence was absolute. No transmissions of any kind were permitted. To deceive American intelligence, radio operators from the carriers were left behind in Japan, sending out routine messages to create the illusion that the fleet was still in home waters. On board the ships, the tension was palpable. The journey was arduous. The seas were violent, with massive waves crashing over the flight decks, threatening to tear the anchored planes from their moorings. The men endured freezing temperatures and constant anxiety. Every shadow on the horizon, every stray radio signal, could mean discovery and disaster. They were a ghost fleet, a phantom armada, sailing toward a destiny known only to a handful of men at the highest levels of command. Commander Mitsuo Fuchida, the man who would lead the air attack, spent the voyage studying maps and briefing his pilots. He was the embodiment of the confident, highly skilled Japanese aviator. He radiated an aura of calm authority that inspired his men. In the final days of the journey, he gathered his pilots in the briefing room of the flagship Akagi. A large, detailed model of Pearl Harbor and Ford Island was unveiled. For many of the men, this was the first time they learned of their true target. A wave of shock and excitement rippled through the room. This was not some remote colonial outpost. This was the main bastion of the enemy, the lair of the American dragon. Fuchida's final briefing was stark and motivating. He outlined the plan, the targets, the signals. He reminded them of the honor of their mission, of the fate of the empire that rested upon their wings. He concluded with a simple, powerful message: they were to succeed, no matter the cost. As the fleet drew closer to its launch point, a final coded message was received from Tokyo. It contained the phrase Nitaka Yama Nobor, which translated to climb Mount Nitaka. This was the pre-arranged signal, the final irrevocable order to proceed with the attack. The negotiations in Washington had failed. There would be no turning back. The mood on the ships became electric, a mixture of fatalistic resolve and feverish anticipation. The sailors and airmen prepared for battle. They donned clean uniforms, a ritual practice so they would be presentable if they were to die and meet their ancestors. They wrote their last letters home. They tied hachimaki, white headbands symbolizing courage and devotion, around their foreheads. In the pre-dawn hours of December 7th, the Kido Butai reached its launch point, approximately 230 miles north of Oahu. The sea was still rough, the carriers pitching and rolling in the heavy swell, but the sky above was beginning to clear. The conditions were difficult, but acceptable. On the flight deck of the Akagi, the green signal lamp glowed. The roar of engines became a physical force, a wall of sound that vibrated through the steel hull of the ship. The first Zero fighter, light and agile, sped down the deck and lifted gracefully into the darkness, its navigation lights blinking. One by one, the planes of the first wave followed, a seemingly endless stream of fighters, bombers and torpedo planes, launching from all 6 carriers. It was a masterful display of seamanship and flight operations, a feat never before accomplished on this scale. Within an hour, 183 aircraft were airborne, circling into formation under Fuchida's command. As they formed up, the eastern sky began to glow, heralding the sunrise. Fuchida set his course due south. Below them, the vast, dark ocean. Ahead, an unsuspecting island paradise. The silent dagger, having crossed a third of the globe undetected, was now unsheathed and poised to strike. The men of the Kido Butai had done the impossible. They had brought the war to America's doorstep. Now all that remained was to see if their blade was as sharp as their resolve. While the Kido Butai sliced through the dark waters of the North Pacific, the American military establishment on Oahu existed in a state of paradoxical awareness. They were on alert, yet they were not alarmed. They possessed fragments of a puzzle that, if assembled correctly, would have revealed a terrifying picture. But a combination of bureaucratic inertia, inter-service rivalry, preconceived notions, and a catastrophic failure of imagination left them blind to the approaching danger. The island fortress of Oahu, believed by many to be impregnable, was in reality an island asleep, its guardians lulled into a false sense of security. The senior commanders on Oahu were Admiral Husband E. Kimmel, Commander-in-Chief of the U.S. Pacific Fleet, and Lieutenant General Walter C. Short, the Army's commanding general of the Hawaiian Department. Both were capable, respected officers who had reached the pinnacle of their careers. They were not incompetent men, but they were men trapped by the prevailing strategic assumptions of their time. In the autumn of 1941, they were receiving a stream of intelligence from Washington that was both urgent and maddeningly vague. On November 27th, they received the most explicit warning yet. It came from the Chief of Naval Operations in Washington, Admiral Harold Stark. The message began with a stark, unambiguous phrase: "This dispatch is to be considered a war warning." It stated that negotiations with Japan had broken down, and that hostile action was possible at any moment. It directed Kimmel and Short to undertake a defensive deployment preparatory to carrying out their war plans. However, the message also contained a fatal piece of misdirection. It listed the likely targets of a Japanese attack as the Philippines, the Kra Peninsula in Thailand, or Borneo. Hawaii was not mentioned. This omission reinforced the dominant belief within the American High Command. The strategic thinking was that Japan's primary objective was the resource-rich regions of Southeast Asia. A direct attack on Pearl Harbor seemed illogical, a suicidal risk for the Japanese with little strategic gain. Why would they attack the strongest American base in the Pacific, when their main objectives lay thousands of miles to the southwest? It was believed that any Japanese action against the United States would begin with sabotage. Hawaii had a large population of Japanese ancestry, and the fear, fueled by racial prejudice, was that a fifth column of saboteurs and spies was the most immediate threat. This fear would shape the defensive preparations on the island in a way that left it fatally vulnerable to the actual threat. General Short, responsible for the defense of the island and its military installations, interpreted the war warning through this lens of sabotage. He ordered his forces to a heightened state of alert, but it was an alert against internal threats, not an external attack. At the island's airfields, Hickam, Wheeler, and Bellows, he ordered the planes to be parked in neat tight rows, wingtip to wingtip, out in the open on the tarmac. This made them easier to guard against saboteurs on the ground. It also, tragically, turned them into perfect targets for an air raid. A single strafing run, or a well-placed bomb, could destroy dozens of aircraft at once. Similarly, anti-aircraft ammunition was kept in central depots, under lock and key, to prevent it from being stolen. The guns were in place, but the ammunition was not readily available. In trying to protect his assets from a phantom menace, Short had inadvertently set the table for their complete destruction from the air. Admiral Kimmel, for his part, also took action. He sent his most valuable assets, the aircraft carriers, out to sea. The USS Enterprise was delivering planes to Wake Island, and the USS Lexington was en route to Midway. This was a stroke of incredible fortune, a decision based on routine operations that would save the core of the Pacific Fleet's offensive power. But the battleships, the symbols of naval might, remained in port. Kimmel increased air patrols, but the reconnaissance flights he ordered were primarily to the south and west, the directions from which an attack was expected to come. The vast, empty expanse of the North Pacific, the route the Kido Butai was actually taking, was left largely unwatched. Meanwhile, in Washington, the pieces of the puzzle were falling into place, but no one was putting them together. The Magic Intelligence Program was a marvel of cryptology. American codebreakers were reading Japan's most secret diplomatic traffic. They knew that the Japanese embassy in Washington had been ordered to destroy its code machines. They knew that a final 14-part message was being transmitted, a formal and lengthy rejection of the American position that was clearly a prelude to war. They knew that the final part of this message was to be delivered to Secretary of State Cordell Hull at precisely 1 p.m. Washington time on December 7th, a time that corresponded to dawn in Hawaii. The connection seems obvious in hindsight, a blaring siren. But at the time it was just one more piece of information in a flood of intelligence, and the different branches of the military and government did not effectively share or synthesize what they knew. The Army and Navy had their own intelligence divisions, which often competed more than they cooperated. On the morning of December 7th, the final pieces of intelligence that could have averted disaster arrived, only to be stymied by a tragic series of mishaps and human errors. In Washington, a brilliant intelligence officer, Colonel Rufus Bratton, read the final part of the Japanese message and the instruction for its delivery time. He immediately understood the significance. He knew 1 p.m. in Washington was sunrise over the Pacific. He tried frantically to get a warning to the overseas commanders. He reached General George C. Marshall, the Army Chief of Staff, who was out for his Sunday morning horseback ride. When Marshall finally saw the message, he too recognized the danger. He drafted a new urgent warning to be sent to all Pacific commands, including Hawaii. He wanted to use the Navy's more secure communications system, but was told it would cause delays, so he sent it via the Army's radio network. But due to atmospheric interference, the message couldn't get through to the Army headquarters in Hawaii. So the telegraph operator, seeking to ensure its delivery, sent it via a commercial Western Union telegram. The telegram, stripped of its urgency, was passed to a bicycle messenger, who would pedal his way toward General Short's headquarters as the first bombs began to fall. Back on Oahu, the two final direct warnings were also mishandled. The first was the sinking of the midget submarine by the U.S. Ward at 6:45 a.m. The report of the action was clear: A hostile submarine had been engaged and destroyed within the defensive sea area of Pearl Harbor. This was an act of war, happening right at the entrance to the naval base. Yet the report was met with bureaucratic delay. It was passed up the chain of command, with each officer taking time to verify, to consider, to await confirmation. The sense of imminent crisis was absent. It was treated as a curious incident, not as the prelude to a full-scale assault. Then came the radar sighting at Opana Point. At 7:02 a.m., Privates Lockard and Elliott detected a massive flight of aircraft approaching from the north. This was the one piece of technological evidence that could have laid the Japanese plan bare. It was a direct, unambiguous picture of the attacking force. But the warning fell on the deaf ears of a single inexperienced officer, Lieutenant Kermit Tyler. His assumption that the blip was a flight of friendly B-17s was not entirely unreasonable. Such a flight was indeed expected. But his failure to seek any further information, to treat the report with the seriousness it deserved, to even consider the possibility that it might be hostile, represented the final, fatal failure in a long chain of errors. His casual dismissal, well, don't worry about it, effectively shut down the island's last line of defense. And so as the Japanese planes roared towards their targets, the island of Oahu remained blissfully unaware. The sailors of the Pacific Fleet were waking up to a beautiful Sunday. Church services were being planned. Bands were preparing to play the national anthem. On the airfields, the rows of gleaming aircraft sat silently in the morning sun, perfect targets. In the command centers, officers were sipping their morning coffee, believing that if war came, it would come thousands of miles away, announced by formal declaration. They had the information, they had the warnings, they had the technology, but they lacked the one crucial element, the imagination to believe that the impossible was about to happen. They had prepared for the wrong war, in the wrong way. The sentries were at their posts, but they were all looking in the wrong direction. The giant was not just sleeping, it was dreaming of a peace that had already vanished. The time is 7:55 a.m. The Hawaiian sun is climbing into a brilliant blue sky, casting a golden light across the tranquil waters of Pearl Harbor. The first wave of 183 Japanese aircraft, having achieved complete and devastating surprise, begins its descent. Commander Mitsuo Fuchida, looking down from his bomber, sees the pristine panorama of American naval power laid out before him. It is a sight that exceeds his most optimistic hopes. The element of surprise is absolute. His famous radio signal, Tora, 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 confirms the success of their great gamble. For the men on the ships and bases below, the last seconds of peace evaporate into the shriek of diving planes and the thunder of explosions. The world is about to be torn apart. The attack is a model of brutal, synchronized efficiency. The first targets are the airfields. The Japanese planners knew that the greatest threat to their bombers was America's fighter planes. They had to be eliminated on the ground before they could ever take off. At Wheeler Field, the main fighter base, dozens of P-40 Warhawks and P-36 Mohawks are parked in neat, vulnerable rows. Japanese Zeros sweep in at treetop level, their machine guns and cannons spitting fire. The sound is like a monstrous canvas being ripped. The American planes, fueled and armed, erupt into fireballs. One after another, a chain reaction of destruction turns the airfield into a junkyard of burning metal. At Hickam Field, the bombers meet a similar fate. B-17Cs, B-18Cs, and A-20Cs are systematically destroyed on the ground. The hangars and barracks are strafed, cutting down soldiers as they run in confusion from their beds. In a matter of minutes, the air power on Oahu is effectively neutralized. A handful of American pilots, with breathtaking courage, manage to get their planes into the air. Lieutenants George Welch and Kenneth Taylor, who had been at an all-night party, race to a satellite field, take off in their P-40 Says, and engage the enemy, managing to shoot down several Japanese planes. But they are a heroic exception. For the most part, the sky belongs to the attackers. With the airfields burning, the main assault turns to the primary target, Battleship Row. The Kate torpedo bombers, their specially modified weapons slung beneath their fuselages, come in low and fast over the water. They are flying at just 40 or 50 feet, a testament to their incredible skill and training. The sailors on the decks of the battleships look up, first in curiosity, then in dawning horror. They see the red circle of the rising sun on the wings, the meatball as they called it. They see the torpedoes drop into the water, churning a white wake as they race toward the helpless steel hulls. The USS Oklahoma, moored outboard of the USS Maryland, is one of the first to be hit. 3 torpedoes strike its port side in quick succession. The massive 29,000-ton vessel shudders violently. Water pours in through the gaping holes. The ship immediately begins to list, slowly at first, then with terrifying speed. Below decks, it is a scene of unimaginable horror. Men are trapped in darkness as lights fail. Water rushes in, and the world turns upside down. Loose equipment, ammunition, and bodies are thrown about as the ship capsizes. Within 12 minutes of the first hit, the USS Oklahoma has rolled completely over, its red bottom exposed to the sky, its masts stuck in the mud of the harbor floor. Over 400 men are trapped inside its steel tomb. Nearby, the USS West Virginia is struck by as many as 9 torpedoes. The ship is torn open, and it begins to sink rapidly. Its commander, Captain Mervyn Bennion, is mortally wounded by shrapnel from a bomb that hit the neighboring USS Tennessee, but he refuses to leave his post on the bridge, continuing to direct his ship's defense until he bleeds to death. On the deck, a mess attendant named Doris Miller, a young African-American man who, due to the segregated policies of the Navy at the time, was not trained in combat, distinguishes himself with extraordinary heroism. He helps move his wounded captain to a safer spot, and then, without orders, he mans an unattended .50 caliber machine gun and begins firing at the attacking planes. He later recalled, "It wasn't hard, I just pulled the trigger, and she worked fine." For his bravery, he would become the first African-American to be awarded the Navy Cross. But the greatest single tragedy of the day is reserved for the USS Arizona. At approximately 8:10 a.m., a high-level bomber flying at 10,000 feet releases a 760-pound armor-piercing bomb. The bomb, a modified 16-inch naval shell, slices through the Arizona's deck near its forward turrets. It penetrates deep into the ship, down into the black powder magazine, and the forward aviation fuel stores. The result is a cataclysmic explosion. The entire front of the battleship is lifted out of the water by a colossal fireball that rises hundreds of feet into the air. The concussion from the blast is felt for miles, knocking men off the decks of other ships. The USS Arizona is effectively destroyed in a single horrifying instant. It sinks to the bottom of the harbor in less than 9 minutes, taking 1,177 of its crew with it. For many of them, there was no time even to comprehend what was happening. They were vaporized, entombed in a steel coffin that would become their final resting place. The ship burns for 2.5 days, a funeral pyre that casts a pall of black, oily smoke over the harbor. All along Battleship Row, the scene is one of carnage and chaos. The USS California is hit by torpedoes and bombs and begins to slowly sink. The USS Nevada, the only battleship to get underway during the attack, becomes a prime target. As it steams down the channel, trying to make it to the open sea, it is swarmed by Japanese dive bombers. Fearing it will be sunk in the narrow channel, blocking the harbor entrance, its crew makes the decision to intentionally run it aground. The USS Tennessee and USS Maryland, protected by the ships moored alongside them, suffer less damage. The USS Pennsylvania in dry dock is also hit. The smaller ships in the harbor are not spared. The light cruiser Helena is torpedoed. The destroyers Cassin and Downs are destroyed in their dry dock. The mine layer Oglala is sunk. The harbor, which just an hour before was a scene of Sunday morning peace, is now a vision of hell. The water is covered in a thick layer of burning oil. The air is filled with the shriek of planes, the thunder of explosions, the rattle of anti-aircraft fire, and the screams of the wounded and dying. At 8:54 a.m., the second wave of 171 Japanese aircraft arrives. Led by Lieutenant Commander Shigekazu Shimazaki, this wave focuses on finishing off the remaining targets and strafing the airfields and bases again. But by now, the defenders are fighting back. The element of surprise is gone. Anti-aircraft fire, from ships and shore batteries, is now intense and increasingly accurate. Machine guns, many of them hastily set up, chatter defiantly at the sky. The second wave faces a much tougher reception than the first, and it suffers heavier losses. But it still inflicts significant damage, adding to the chaos and destruction. By 9:45 a.m., it is over. The last of the Japanese planes turn and head back north to their carriers. They leave behind a scene of utter devastation. In the space of about 90 minutes, the heart of the U.S. Pacific Fleet has been shattered. 18 ships are sunk or heavily damaged. Nearly 200 aircraft are destroyed, with another 150 damaged. The human cost is staggering. 2,403 Americans are killed, and 1,178 are wounded. The Japanese losses are astonishingly light in comparison. 29 aircraft and 5 midget submarines lost, with 64 men killed. As the planes disappear over the horizon, a stunned silence descends upon Pearl Harbor, broken only by the crackle of flames, the hiss of water on hot metal, and the cries of the wounded. The sky is black with smoke. The water is a slick of oil and debris. The proud battleships of the fleet are either sunk, capsized, or burning wrecks. The men who survived, covered in oil and blood, look at the destruction around them in a state of shock and disbelief. This was not war as they had imagined it. This was a massacre. The myth of American invulnerability, the idea of the Pacific as an American lake, had been shattered in an hour and a half of fire and steel. The sleeping giant had not just been poked, it had been grievously wounded. The day that President Franklin D. Roosevelt would famously declare a date which will live in infamy was drawing to a close, but its consequences were just beginning. For America, the age of innocence was over. The war had come home. As the last Japanese aircraft vanished into the vast Pacific sky, the roar of their engines was replaced by a new and more terrible soundscape, the symphony of aftermath. It was the roar of uncontrolled fires, the groaning of tortured steel, the desperate shouts of rescuers, and the moans of the wounded. The brilliant Hawaiian morning had been transformed into a vision from Dante's Inferno. A thick, greasy pillar of black smoke from the burning USS Arizona dominated the sky, a funeral pyre visible from every corner of Oahu, a stark monument to the morning's catastrophe. The once placid waters of the harbor were now a hellish cauldron of flaming oil, debris, and the floating bodies of the dead. For the survivors, shock gave way to a frantic, desperate urgency. The immediate aftermath of the attack was not a time for reflection or grief. It was a time for action. Sailors, soldiers, and Marines, many of them teenagers who had never seen combat, became instant veterans. Their youth burned away in the fires of Battleship Row. They fought to save their ships and their shipmates with a raw, primal courage. Firefighting teams battled raging blazes on the decks of the Tennessee and Maryland. On the capsized hull of the USS Oklahoma, a scene of both horror and heroism unfolded. Hundreds of men were trapped inside the overturned ship, plunged into a terrifying world of darkness, rising water, and foul air. Their only hope was the sound of their own desperate banging against the steel hull. On the outside, civilian yard workers and Navy personnel heard the faint tapping. They immediately began a grim and arduous rescue operation, working around the clock with acetylene torches and pneumatic hammers to cut through the thick steel plates of the hull. It was a race against time. The air inside was running out. For hours, they worked, the hiss of their torches a beacon of hope in the smoky darkness. They managed to pull 32 men out alive, one by one from their steel tomb. But for the more than 400 others, the Oklahoma became their final grave. Medical facilities on the island were instantly overwhelmed. The naval hospital, designed for a peacetime capacity, was inundated with a flood of casualties. Doctors and nurses worked with frantic determination, performing triage in the hallways, operating in makeshift theaters. The sheer scale of the injuries was horrific. Terrible burns from the flaming oil on the water, grievous wounds from shrapnel, crushed limbs, and profound shock. Civilian doctors and nurses from Honolulu rushed to the military hospitals to help, a testament to the community's immediate, unified response. Blood donation centers were set up, and lines of volunteers stretched for blocks. The attack had not just struck a naval base, it had struck a community, and that community was now bound together in a shared ordeal of suffering and resolve. Across the island, fear mingled with anger. The initial shock of the air raid was quickly followed by a pervasive dread. Was this the prelude to a land invasion? Rumors spread like wildfire. Japanese paratroopers had been spotted in the mountains. Saboteurs were poisoning the water supply. A second attack was imminent. A total blackout was imposed that night. The once bright lights of Honolulu and the military bases were extinguished, plunging the island into a nervous, unfamiliar darkness. Sentries, jumpy and exhausted, clutched their rifles, firing at shadows. The friendly, relaxed atmosphere of Aloha was replaced by the grim, suspicious reality of a war zone. While the fires still burned in Pearl Harbor, the news of the attack was racing across the globe, a seismic shockwave that would upend the world order. In Washington, D.C., it was early afternoon. The first garbled reports began to trickle in. Secretary of the Navy Frank Knox received the initial message from Admiral Kimmel, "Air raid on Pearl Harbor X. This is not drill." Knox was stunned. He immediately called President Franklin D. Roosevelt at the White House. Roosevelt, who was in his study working on his stamp collection, took the call. He listened intently, his face a mask of grim disbelief. He knew, in that instant, that his long, difficult struggle to prepare the nation for a war it did not want was over. The war had come to America, delivered by a blow of stunning treachery. Roosevelt immediately began to convene his military and cabinet advisors. The White House became the nerve center of a nation, suddenly at war. The reports from Hawaii grew progressively worse throughout the afternoon, each new dispatch painting a more complete and devastating picture of the losses. The initial disbelief hardened into a cold, determined fury. That evening, Roosevelt met with his full cabinet. According to eyewitnesses, he was calm, but his anger was palpable. He told them, "We are all in the same boat now." He began to work on the speech he would deliver to Congress and the American people the next day. His first draft began, a date which will live in world history. He personally revised it, crossing out world history and writing in a phrase that would resonate with righteous anger for generations. A date which will live in infamy. On Monday, December 8th, a somber and unified Congress gathered to hear the president. The chamber was packed. The mood was not one of debate or dissent, but of solemn, unified purpose. Roosevelt, his voice steady and filled with resolve, recounted the events of the previous day, branding the attack an unprovoked and dastardly act. He declared that the American people, in their righteous might, would win through to absolute victory. He asked Congress to declare that since the attack on December 7, 1941, a state of war had existed between the United States and the Japanese Empire. The vote was nearly unanimous. In the House of Representatives, the vote was 388 to 1. The lone dissenting vote came from Jeannette Rankin, a pacifist who had also voted against America's entry into World War I. In the Senate, the vote was a unanimous 82 to 0. In less than an hour, the United States was formally at war. The declaration of war unleashed a wave of patriotic fervor across the country, unlike anything seen before. The deep divisions between isolationists and interventionists, which had defined American political life for years, vanished overnight. Pearl Harbor had forged a new and powerful national unity, a shared sense of violation and a collective demand for retribution. Recruiting stations were mobbed with young men, eager to enlist and avenge the attack. From the farms of the Midwest to the factories of the Northeast, from the cities to the small towns, America was united in a common cause. The sleeping giant, as Admiral Yamamoto had reportedly feared, was now awake and filled with a terrible resolve. But this new unity had a dark side. The anger and fear directed at the Empire of Japan quickly and tragically spilled over onto Japanese Americans. Decades of anti-Asian prejudice, fanned by hysterical media reports and political fear-mongering, erupted into a frenzy of suspicion and hatred. Despite a lack of any evidence of espionage or sabotage by the Japanese-American community, they were branded as a potential fifth column. The press and politicians called for their removal from the West Coast. This wave of racial hysteria would culminate a few months later in Roosevelt's signing of Executive Order 9066, which authorized the forced internment of over 120,000 people of Japanese descent, the majority of them American citizens. It was a shameful chapter in American history, a profound betrayal of the very democratic ideals the nation was now fighting to defend. The wreckage of paradise was not confined to the twisted steel of Pearl Harbor. It extended to the shattered lives and stolen liberties of loyal American citizens. Back in Hawaii, the slow, grim work of recovery continued. The dead were identified and buried. The wounded began their long road to recovery, and the monumental task of salvage began. The Navy was determined to raise and repair as many of the damaged ships as possible. It was a Herculean effort that would take years. The U.S. California and West Virginia, both sunk at their moorings, would eventually be refloated, repaired, and would return to fight in the later stages of the war. But for the U.S. Arizona and the USS Oklahoma, there was no recovery. They were too grievously damaged. Their broken hulls would remain in the harbor, one a memorial, the other eventually salvaged for scrap, both permanent physical scars of that terrible Sunday morning. The immediate aftermath of Pearl Harbor was a period of pain, anger, and fear, but it was also the beginning of a profound transformation. A nation had been attacked, and its response would not only determine the outcome of the Second World War, but would also reshape the course of the 20th century and America's role within it. The fires in the harbor would eventually be extinguished, but the fire that had been lit in the heart of the American people would burn for years to come. The attack on Pearl Harbor was intended by Japan to be a knockout blow, a strategic masterpiece that would paralyze the United States and give the empire a free hand to conquer Asia. In the short term, it was a stunning tactical success, but in the long term, it proved to be one of the most catastrophic strategic blunders in the history of modern warfare. The 90 minutes of fire and destruction on December 7, 1941, did not break the will of the American people. Instead, it forged it into an unbreakable weapon. The sleeping giant of American industrial and military potential was not just awakened, it was galvanized into a force of unprecedented scale and power, a force that would ultimately crush the Axis powers and fundamentally reshape the global order. In the immediate aftermath, the strategic situation in the Pacific was dire for the United States and its allies. With the American battleship fleet crippled, Japan launched a lightning-fast offensive across Southeast Asia and the Pacific. The Philippines, Guam, and Wake Island fell. The The British fortresses of Hong Kong and Singapore, once thought impregnable, were captured with shocking speed. The Dutch East Indies, with their vital oil fields, were overrun. The Japanese military seemed invincible, an unstoppable tide sweeping across the ocean. For the first 6 months after Pearl Harbor, Admiral Yamamoto's prediction proved chillingly accurate. He was indeed running wild. The Japanese established a vast defensive perimeter, stretching from the Aleutian Islands in the north to the jungles of New Guinea in the south. It seemed as though their gamble had paid off, but the architects of the Pearl Harbor attack had made several critical errors. First, their focus on the battleships was a reflection of an outdated naval doctrine. The future of naval warfare did not belong to the heavily armored gunship, it belonged to the aircraft carrier. By a stroke of sheer luck, America's carriers were at sea on December 7th and escaped the attack unscathed. The USS Enterprise, Lexington, and Saratoga became the core of the U.S. Navy's ability to fight back. The loss of the battleships, while a devastating blow to morale, inadvertently forced the U.S. Navy to abandon its battleship-centric strategy and embrace carrier aviation as its primary offensive arm. This forced evolution in naval thinking would prove decisive in the battles to come. Second, the Japanese failed to destroy the naval base's critical infrastructure. The oil storage tanks, which held millions of barrels of fuel, were left untouched. The submarine base and the repair facilities were also spared. The destruction of these targets would have crippled American naval operations in the Pacific for a year or more, forcing the fleet to operate from the west coast of the United States. Admiral Nagumo, the cautious commander of the Kido Butai, chose not to launch a third wave to attack these targets, fearing for the safety of his carriers. This decision would be remembered as a massive strategic failure. While the military reeled from the initial blows, the true source of American power, its industrial base, began to stir. President Roosevelt called upon the nation to become the arsenal of democracy. The transformation of the American economy from peacetime production to wartime footing was an industrial miracle. Automobile factories stopped making cars and started building tanks and planes. Shipyards, working 24 hours a day, began to produce ships at a rate the world had never seen. The sheer scale of American production was something the Japanese leadership had failed to comprehend. By 1944, the United States was producing more war material than all of the Axis powers combined. For every one ship the Japanese could build, the Americans built dozens. For every plane lost, hundreds of new, more advanced models rolled off the assembly lines. This overwhelming material advantage, once fully mobilized, made the outcome of a long war a mathematical certainty. This industrial mobilization also had profound social consequences. With millions of men enlisting in the armed forces, a massive labor shortage opened up. Women poured into the factories to fill the gap, taking on jobs that had previously been considered the exclusive domain of men. Rosie the Riveter became a national icon, a symbol of the female workforce that was crucial to the war effort. This experience would permanently alter the role of women in American society, planting the seeds for future movements for gender equality. In the Pacific theater, the tide began to turn with surprising speed. The first sign of American resolve came in April 1942 with the Doolittle raid. In a daring one-way mission, 16 B-25 bombers launched from the aircraft carrier U.S. Hornet and bombed Tokyo and other Japanese cities. The raid did little physical damage, but its psychological impact was immense. It proved to the Japanese people that they were not invulnerable, and it provided a much-needed morale boost for the American public. The raid also had a crucial strategic consequence. It convinced the Japanese high command that they needed to extend their defensive perimeter to prevent future attacks. This led them to plan an invasion of Midway Island, a small atoll northwest of Hawaii. It was a decision that would lead them directly into a trap. American naval intelligence, led by the brilliant codebreaker Joseph Rochefort and his team at Station Hypo in Hawaii, had achieved a monumental breakthrough. They had partially broken the Japanese naval code, JN-25. They knew the Japanese were planning a major offensive, and they were able to deduce that Midway was the target. Admiral Chester Nimitz, who had replaced Kimmel as the commander of the Pacific Fleet, took a massive gamble. He gathered his 3 available carriers, the Enterprise, Hornet, and the hastily repaired Yorktown, and set an ambush for the Japanese fleet near Midway. The Battle of Midway, fought in June 1942, just 6 months after Pearl Harbor, was the decisive turning point of the Pacific War. In a stunning reversal of fortune, American dive bombers caught the Japanese carriers at their most vulnerable moment, as they were rearming and refueling their planes. In the space of 5 minutes, 3 of the 4 Japanese carriers that had attacked Pearl Harbor, the Akage, Kaga, and Soryu, were turned into burning wrecks. A 4th, the Hiryu, was sunk later that day. The Japanese Navy lost its best carriers and its most experienced pilots. It was a blow from which they would never recover. The offensive power of the Kido Butai was shattered. The hunter had become the hunted. From Midway onward, the United States was on the offensive. The long, bloody island-hopping campaign began, a brutal war of attrition fought in the jungles of Guadalcanal, across the beaches of Tarawa, Saipan, and Iwo Jima, and in the waters of the Philippine Sea and Leyte Gulf. The Japanese fought with a fanatical ferocity that shocked American soldiers, but they could not stop the relentless advance of the American war machine. The very battleships that had been sunk or damaged at Pearl Harbor were raised, repaired, and returned to the fight. The USS West Virginia, California, Tennessee, Maryland, and Pennsylvania all participated in the final battles of the war, their massive guns providing fire support for amphibious landings, a symbolic and powerful form of retribution. Pearl Harbor also marked the definitive end of American isolationism. The attack shattered the illusion that the United States could remain aloof from the world's conflicts, protected by its two oceans. It ushered in an era of American internationalism and global leadership that would define the post-war world. The United States emerged from World War II as the world's preeminent economic and military superpower, a role it had been reluctant to assume but was now forced to embrace. The attack on a naval base in the Pacific had not only plunged America into a global war, but had also set it on a path to becoming a global empire, with military bases and political influence spanning the planet. The long-term effects of those 90 minutes were profound and far-reaching, transforming not only the United States, but the very structure of international power. The giant, once awakened, would not go back to sleep. The unconditional surrender of Japan in August 1945, brought about by the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki and the Soviet invasion of Manchuria, brought the Second World War to its final, brutal conclusion. The world that emerged from the ashes of that conflict was a world irrevocably changed, a world in which the old empires were collapsing and a new global order, dominated by the United States and the Soviet Union, was taking shape. At the heart of this transformation for America lay the memory of a single Sunday morning. Pearl Harbor was more than just a battle. It became a foundational myth for post-war America, a touchstone of national identity that shaped its foreign policy, its military posture, and its collective consciousness for the remainder of the 20th century and beyond. The legacy of Pearl Harbor is etched in steel and stone, in memory and in policy. In the harbor itself, the most poignant and enduring symbol of the attack rests in the shallow, clear waters. The wreck of the USS Arizona was deemed too damaged and too sacred a tomb to be salvaged. It was left where it sank, a permanent underwater grave for the 1,177 men entombed within its hull. In 1962, the USS Arizona Memorial was dedicated. It is a stark white structure that spans the sunken battleship, a bridge of remembrance built over a site of profound loss. It is a place of solemn pilgrimage, visited by millions who come to pay their respects and to reflect on the cost of war. Looking down from the memorial, one can still see the ghostly outline of the ship below. And even today, more than 80 years later, small drops of oil, the tears of the Arizona, continue to leak from the ship's fuel bunkers and rise slowly to the surface, shimmering iridescently on the water, a constant physical reminder of the life that was violently extinguished in that spot. The phrase "Remember Pearl Harbor" became the rallying cry of the American war effort, a powerful slogan that encapsulated the nation's sense of betrayal and its thirst for vengeance. But over time, the meaning of that phrase has evolved. In the decades following the war, as the visceral anger faded and the generation that fought the war began to pass into history, "Remember Pearl Harbor" became less a call for retribution and more a solemn injunction against complacency. It became a warning about the dangers of unpreparedness, a reminder that peace is fragile and that a nation must always be vigilant. The attack led to a massive reorganization of the American military and intelligence communities, culminating in the creation of the Department of Defense and the Central Intelligence Agency, institutions designed to prevent another such surprise attack from ever happening again. The attack on Pearl Harbor and the intelligence failures that preceded it are still studied today in military academies and intelligence schools as a classic case study in strategic failure. The relationship between the United States and Japan, the two great adversaries of the Pacific War, underwent a transformation that would have been unimaginable to the men who fought and died in that conflict. After the war, under American occupation, Japan was demilitarized and rebuilt as a democratic nation. In one of the great ironies of history, the United States, the nation that Japan had sought to drive from the Pacific, became its closest ally and protector. The two nations, once locked in a death struggle, became cornerstones of a new political and economic order in Asia. This remarkable reconciliation is a testament to the capacity for former enemies to find common ground and build a shared future. Today, Japanese prime ministers have visited the Arizona Memorial to pay their respects, and American presidents have visited Hiroshima, gestures of healing and mutual understanding that close a circle of history that began in fire and ended in friendship. Yet, the scar of Pearl Harbor remains. It is a scar on the American psyche, a reminder of a moment of profound vulnerability. It marked the end of an era of perceived invincibility, the end of a time when America felt safe and secure behind its oceanic moats. In a broader sense, it was America's violent introduction to the complexities and dangers of the modern world. The attack demonstrated that in an age of long-range bombers and aircraft carriers, distance no longer guaranteed safety. This lesson would be relearned with even greater and more shocking force on another clear morning, 60 years later, on September 11th, 2001. The parallels between the two events are striking. A surprise attack, a catastrophic intelligence failure, a sudden sense of national violation, and a subsequent plunge into a long and difficult war. Both events served as catalysts, transforming American society and its relationship with the rest of the world. For the individuals who survived it, the memory of December 7, 1941, never faded. It was a searing, defining moment that they carried with them for the rest of their lives. The Pearl Harbor Survivors Association, for many years a vibrant organization, served as a brotherhood for these men, a way to share their stories, and to ensure that the sacrifices of their fallen comrades were not forgotten. As the years have passed, their numbers have dwindled. The living connection to that day is fading. Soon there will be no one left who can speak of the attack in the first person, no one who can recall the smell of the smoke, the sound of the explosions, the sight of the burning ships. When that day comes, the story of Pearl Harbor will pass fully from memory into history, a narrative preserved in books, documentaries, and memorials. What then is the ultimate meaning of those 90 minutes? It is a story of immense tragedy, of lives cut short and a world plunged into war. It is a story of incredible heroism, of ordinary men who rose to an extraordinary challenge. It is a cautionary tale about the arrogance of power and the failure of imagination. But perhaps most of all, it is a story about consequences. It demonstrates, with brutal clarity, how a single event, a single morning, can act as a fulcrum upon which the entire world can turn. The decisions made in Tokyo and Washington, the warnings ignored on Oahu, the bombs dropped from the sky, these were not isolated events. They were links in a chain of causation that stretched across the globe and down through the decades, shaping the world we inhabit today. The water over the USS Arizona is calm now. The harbor is once again a place of peace. But the scar remains, a quiet, solemn reminder that history is not a distant, abstract force. It is a living presence, a story written in fire and steel, in sacrifice and in memory, a story that began on a peaceful Sunday morning, in a paradise that was about to be lost forever.